This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details. I start pretty much every Zelda video I've ever done with some alliterative and pretentious preamble of probably pernicious and pointless prattle regarding the illustriously complex timeline of The Legend of Zelda. In all that time, however, I've never dealt with exactly what so many people find confusing or just downright dumb about the timeline. I speak, of course, of the timeline split that occurs as a result of the events of Ocarina of Time. While most people can accept the child and adult timeline, there is a third timeline that is admittedly more confusing. This one occurs when Link loses his epic final battle with Ganondorf, resulting in the Fallen Hero timeline. Many players feel cheated by this timeline because they played Ocarina of Time and Link didn't lose. We saw it. We were there. It also feels cheap because it seems to imply that any game could have an alternate ending where Link loses. But what if I told you that that wasn't the case? What if I told you that the Fallen Hero timeline doesn't refer to a timeline where Link lost that final battle on Ganon's Tower? And what if I told you that not only could this ending only happen in Ocarina of Time, but is required by the exact same time travel rules as the adult and child timeline? I'm John Reardon, you're watching NWR TV, and this is why the Fallen Hero timeline had to happen. In order to understand the Fallen Hero timeline, we must first gain a full and complete understanding of the other two, as these govern Zelda's established time travel rules. In Ocarina of Time, Link travels into the future to fight Ganondorf and save Hyrule. Afterwards, he returns to the past and uses his knowledge of the future to stop Ganondorf from ever taking power. The child timeline, then, is that which continues after Link returns and proceeds without Ganondorf ever taking over. The adult timeline takes place alongside it, with Ganondorf having taken power, but having been defeated by Link as an adult. The Fallen Hero timeline is then, theoretically, a split from the adult timeline in which Link was defeated instead. But if we take a moment and look at how time travel actually works in Ocarina of Time, it'll make us rethink what the Fallen Hero timeline actually is. At the end of Ocarina of Time, when Link leaves the adult timeline and returns to the past, he ceases to exist in the adult timeline. So, this means Link, as the time traveler, only exists in one timeline in a given instance. The second thing we need to note is that the adult timeline continues to exist on its own, and is not the future of the child timeline. The adult timeline continues along a path separate from the child timeline. This implies that Link's time travel itself is what causes the split. When Link travels through time, the universe he left continues to exist and a new one starts. If you've seen the Avengers movies, it has similar rules to that. When someone travels through time, they're not actually traveling along their own timeline, they're hopping over into a parallel one. Now, the clever among you may have already caught the key details here. Link only exists in one timeline, and the splits are caused not by events, but by the time travel itself. Now, what happens when we apply that same logic to the Fallen Hero timeline? In the past, we've assumed that the split into the Fallen Hero timeline was caused by Link losing that final battle at the end of Ocarina of Time, on top of Ganon's Tower. The problem is that by the established lore, that isn't what causes the timeline split. The split is created by time travel. So then you have to ask, what time travel caused the Fallen Hero timeline to exist? Well, we actually have another instance of Link time traveling. After collecting the 3 spiritual stones, Link briefly confronts Ganondorf. He's very quickly overpowered, but proceeds to the Temple of Time after finding the Ocarina of Time. He travels to the future, where he would eventually confront and defeat Ganondorf. By Zelda's time travel rules, this event would have created a split. The timeline left behind by Link would have been left without a hero. This timeline would also, just like the other two, exist separately and without Link, because he left. Ganondorf would be allowed to take power, and there would be no Link to stop him. Sound kind of familiar? Now, it would be easy to assume that when Link returns to the past after defeating Ganondorf, he'd be returning to this original timeline. But that isn't how we've established the system to work. Rather, when Link returns to being a child after traveling to the adult timeline, he created a third timeline, separate both from the adult timeline and his original starting timeline. This leaves us with 3 timelines. One, in which Ganondorf rises to power, but with no one to stop him. A second, where Ganondorf takes power, but is ultimately defeated. And a third, where Ganondorf is stopped before he can take over. It all seems to line up pretty well. Now, I can already hear many of you typing up your comments that the Hyrule Historia specifically says that the Fallen Hero timeline occurs because Link dies as an adult while fighting Ganondorf in his tower at the end of Ocarina of Time. Or perhaps that Link didn't travel through time but merely slept in the Sacred Realm for 7 years. But don't worry, I pitched this script to the entire NWR team before we started doing anything, and we've already discussed all of these arguments, so I'm ready. Here we go. To deal with that first conflict, let's go back and read exactly what our old pal the Hyrule Historia has to say. The Historia mentions the Fallen Hero timeline in 3 places. The first is on the general timeline itself, where it says that the timeline, quote, splits after Ocarina of Time, with one timeline depicting the events that follow Link's triumph over Ganon, and the other his defeat. The second is a note placed at the end of the events of Ocarina of Time that says, if the Hero of Time is defeated, a different timeline will unfold. The third and final description of this timeline occurs as one would expect at the start of the Fallen Hero timeline. This one is the longest and contains the most detail, saying, Link, the Hero of Time, faced defeat at the hands of Ganondorf. The thief obtained the 3 pieces of the Triforce, transformed into the Demon King Ganon, and continued to threaten the world in future eras. A little farther down the page, it rephrases these same events, saying, Ganondorf the Thief obtained the Triforce of Power and managed to get his hands on Princess Zelda. The Hero of Time, Link, challenged him in a battle that would determine Hyrule's very existence, and lost. Finally, for anyone curious, there is one final mention of the Fallen Hero timeline in the Legend of Zelda Encyclopedia. This book, which is from the same series as the Hyrule Historia, contains an updated version of the timeline. The only detail it gives on the Fallen Hero timeline is, the Hero of Time is defeated. Ganondorf steals the Triforce of Courage and Wisdom and becomes the Dark Beast Ganon. The events described could certainly represent the fight against Ganondorf at the end of Ocarina of Time, but that isn't the only battle that fits this description. Link challenged Ganondorf once before, outside the gates of Castletown as he pursued Princess Zelda. Link was soundly defeated by Ganondorf, and then, if we accept that his travel to the future splits the timeline off from the rest, he would have never been seen again, and Ganondorf would be free to reign. He then captured Zelda to obtain the Triforce of Wisdom, and with Link gone, could claim the Triforce of Courage. Now at first, it might be confusing as to how Ganondorf got the Triforce of Courage when Link left that timeline. But if we look at the adult timeline, which also didn't have a Link, that timeline still has a Triforce of Courage. So I guess we can assume that the Triforce itself, the 3 pieces of it, exist in all 3 timelines, regardless of whether their holders are actually present in that timeline or not. In other words, when Link left the Fallen Hero timeline, the Triforce of Courage would essentially be up for grabs. Nothing anywhere ever definitively states when this final battle took place, and were Link to leave the timeline, the battle outside the gate would have been perceived as the final battle to anyone existing in that timeline. But there is one other major issue that we need to deal with, and that is the question of whether or not any time travel actually takes place in Ocarina of Time. This comes up because of one line of in-game text, which is echoed by the Hyrule Historia, stating that Link slept for 7 years. We also see that Link has grown, which would cause us to question if any time travel actually took place. Admittedly, this is probably the best counter-argument to this theory, and it requires a bit of creativity to deal with, but who would I be if I weren't dealing with the stranger points of Zelda lore? I have 2 possible solutions for this issue. One which is lazy, but arguably falls in line with both the interpretation of real-world myth and with the stated intent of the Hyrule Historia, and another that requires a bit more explaining, but I feel ultimately makes more sense. Let's start with a simple one. Just before it lays out the timeline, the Hyrule Historia makes the following clear. This is a telling of tales, passed on through the ages by humans. This chronicle merely collects information that is believed to be true at this time, and there are many obscured and unanswered questions that still lie within the tale. As the stories and storytellers of Hyrule change, so too does its history. Now, the simple interpretation of this quote is that Nintendo is just covering their butts in case they need to retcon something later. But that's no fun. I like to keep my Zelda theories grounded firmly within the contained universe. So, we're taking this quote at face value. Within the limits of the Zelda universe, this quote would imply exactly what it says. These legends are passed down by humans. Fallible humans. Humans who have adapted and interpreted the stories over the years. As that happens, the details get smudged. What was once Link traveling through time is now a 7-year slumber. This falls in line with other references made within the universe to the oral tradition by Fi, who cited its unreliability during the events of Skyward Sword. In other words, Link's sleep was merely a metaphor. We take this same view on many real-world myths and ancient texts. Did the Greek gods truly live at the top of Mount Olympus, or was that merely intended to mean that they lived in the clouds? Did the flood of Exodus in the Bible actually cover the entire world, or just the entire area where the author lived? If we interpret these legends as legends, then we have to take their details with the same view. But for those of you who don't want to take this mythological view to The Legend of Zelda, no problem. Get ready for the more complicated solution. To start, we need to confirm that time travel does indeed exist in Ocarina of Time. While Link could have merely slept in isolation for 7 years, that wouldn't explain his ability to return to being a child. Unless Link is doing some sort of strange anti-sleeping, staying up for so long that he actually travels backwards through time. But I would say that's still time travel. So unless Link is doing that, we have to accept that this is straight up time travel. It also helps us deal with one of the problems presented by time travel in that Link appears to age. Because Link doesn't stay old when he travels back in time, an instance that we know is in fact time travel, we can infer that the rules of this universe adhere to a concept that the physical body is tied to a specific temporal point. So while Link's consciousness moves freely through time, his body is always the appropriate age relative to the time in which he is now existing. And because I know you guys are just as crazy as I am, one additional point. I suspect the reason Zelda didn't age down when she traveled to the past in Skyward Sword is because she traveled using the Gate of Time rather than the Master Sword. This physical temporal lock may be a limitation of the Master Sword rather than the universe itself. But why would Ryuru refer to Link sleeping for 7 years? Well, if we throw out the mythological interpretation theory, then we have to assume that Ryuru himself was either using a metaphor, or he was, at least in a way, telling the truth. If Link's physical form did sleep, it would have been sleeping in the Sacred Realm, a realm that exists, seemingly, as another dimension, separate from Hyrule. As a different dimension, its progression through time is not necessarily a constant when compared to Hyrule. It may exist outside of our understanding of linear time. When Ryuru says you've been sleeping, he may simply mean that Link has been inactive in Hyrule. This concept of Link passing through a dimension outside of linear time also explains how he gets back to the past. If you can hop outside of linear time, then you could theoretically hop back into it at any point. The progression of time would no longer really have any meaning because you'd be outside of it. Yeah, time traveling. It's confusing but fun. As I said, this whole is Link sleeping or actually traveling through time thing is probably the best argument against my theory, but I do have one final piece of evidence that may help convince some of you holdouts. In order to definitively prove that the Fallen Hero timeline split from the child era and not the adult era, we'd need to prove that an event that adult Link accomplished prior to his fight with Ganondorf never happened in the Fallen Hero timeline. If there is evidence of adult Link in the Fallen Hero timeline, then it couldn't have split up from the child era. But if, for example, a character or characters who were killed by adult Link are still alive in the Fallen Hero timeline, then Link can't have been an adult when the split occurred. Makes sense, because then those characters wouldn't be there anymore. And luckily, we have just such a case. In the two Game Boy Color Legend of Zelda games, Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, the Gerudo Witches, Kome and Kotake, work together to resurrect Ganon. Other than seeing their models reused in Majora's Mask, this is the only time we see these two characters outside of Ocarina of Time. Only one problem, of course. Adult Link killed these two characters in Ocarina of Time. And I don't mean he ambiguously defeated them. I mean, he straight up killed them. We actually see their spirits ascending to the afterlife. So, how can they be alive in ages and seasons? Because Link never killed them. Because it split off from the child timeline, not the adult timeline. The only way we can avoid Link killing them is if the timeline split happened before he fought them. That means that Link never died. He simply disappeared from that timeline. The last anyone in that timeline saw of the hero who saved the Kokiri, Zora, and Gorons was him fleeing a losing battle with Ganondorf, his final battle. Zelda was presumably rescued by Impa, another sage, or perhaps a hero we haven't heard of yet. The survivors then bound together to unite the sages and eventually seal Ganon away, just as it says at the beginning of A Link to the Past. But before I go, I want to bring up one final issue. In the course of Ocarina of Time, Link does have to return to being a child a few times in order to get items or do things in the past in order to progress in the future. By our own logic, each time he did this, he would have created yet more universes. So if you were confused by there being 3 timelines coming off of Ocarina, I have some terrible news. There could be many more. In fact, there should be many more. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. Give it a like if you liked it, and leave a comment with your thoughts or your angry rants, because boy, the timeline gets us all very hot and bothered. If you'd like to chat even more about this or any other Nintendo-related stuff, join our Discord. There's a link in the description. Check out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more, and stick around for some info on our Patreon if you want to help us out. Once again, I'm John Reardon, and I will see you next time. Bye. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.